Hello and welcome to the PriceWriters podcast with Catrin Townsend and me, Jeremy Keating. Join us as we explore and discuss the world of insurance-related books, offering our insights and recommendations. And today we are talking about A Risky Business, an actuary's guide to quantifying and managing risk in society, which is written by our very own Catrin Townsend. So, Catrin, this episode is all about the process of how you came to write your book. So, first off, what gave you the idea for writing a book?
It was never really on my roadmap to write a book. But during COVID, during lockdowns, I was on maternity leave and my dad, who is widowed, was all by himself as well. And so we'd have these long, rambling phone conversations about what I would be doing in the office if I was at work. And our conversations would often also talk about the news cycle. We really set the world to rights. What can be done about social care, and also things that were very relevant at the time, such as the R rate and the different types of models that different institutions were coming out with. And I remember at one point I'd made some comments on the type of model that the university had produced. And I said, well, that's why I think that R rate is actually going to be a little bit higher than the others. And he said, how do you know all of this stuff? And I was like, because I'm an actuary. All of this, like stochastic models, mortality models, pensions funding, all of this is actuarial science. It was just one of those light bulb moments when you realize that no one else is connecting how your job impacts them. So I just really wanted to write a book that told people that actuarial work is accessible. Yes, of course, you shouldn't have to do all the exams to find out what we do. But equally, I wanted to make it relevant for people. We actually are incredibly vital in a modern society in terms of pensions, risk transfer, catastrophes, and climate change. And I just wanted people to see that.
I totally agree with you. It is wonderful to see a book that is about actuarial science that is actually really accessible to lots of people. I know it's a book that you can give to someone, a partner or your family, for them to actually understand what we do as actuaries. Who would you say is the audience for your book? And did you imagine that person when you were writing it?
There were kind of two audiences. There's a lot of overlap between them, but one was my dad, and kind of more generally, I suppose, someone who is educated and interested, but not in this area. So someone who is interested in discussing pensions funding, but doesn't necessarily want all the calculations. Someone who m- meets up against actuarial work and wants to have detailed discussions about how those things impact their lives, but without all of the really heavy going maths. So whether that's educated lay people or even people you work with, underwriters or other people in your insurance company, again, your work is going to impact them and they probably should understand how. So that was the first group of people. And then the second audience was really me, but about 10 years ago.
Mm.
I grew up in rural Wales and being an actuary felt so I didn't even know what it was. And the idea of becoming an actuary and moving to London felt so far out of my frame of reference that I wouldn't have believed you if you told me that was going to happen. And even when I was at university, I didn't know what an actuary did. I remember asking my friends, like, why are you all applying for actuarial roles? And they were just like, it's good money and mathsy and a stable job. So sounds good. Yeah, all right. And I jumped on that bandwagon. But I just really feel like people who are interested in maybe making this their career, or people who have chosen to make it their career but are looking for different parts of actuarial work. Like, I was lucky that I started in personal lines reserving, then moved to personalized pricing, then that got closed down, so I got moved to commercial lines pricing. So in the span of about 2 years, I actually saw several different aspects of actuarial work. A lot of people don't get that option. A lot of people, their first job is in pensions, then they're going to stay in pensions the rest of their working lives. I just wanted to put out lots of different options because there's lots of different elements to risk and risk quantification. So I just wanted to give people a bit of a buffet of the kind of things that we do for them to then go and explore more if they want to.
I do think that's a key part of your book is actually showing just the breadth of actuarial work. I think that's a key reason why we often struggle to articulate what we do for work, because actually it is quite broad and many different actuaries work in actually quite diverse areas. So general insurance and life insurance actually are really quite different, which is often sort surprising, I suppose, to people outside of insurance. So I think many people want to write a book. Like a lot of people think to themselves, I have a book in me, but how did you go about the actual writing part?
The very first chapter was recorded by my dad. I didn't realize I was telling him all about, I can't remember what it was. I think it was fat social care.
Mhm.
And he recorded me talking about it and then sent it back to me saying, I think this is a great outline of a chapter of book.
Wow.
I'm not saying you should record people without their
Yeah.
consent, but um, he was right. That was the framework for that section, and I had to tidy that up and put in more information. But that was the first point that I thought, oh, maybe there is a book in this, not just a blog post or a LinkedIn article. The next couple of chapters, if I'm honest, were typed one-handed on my old iPad because I was on maternity leave, and so most of the time I was holding the baby and she would fall asleep and she would never be put down. So the first couple of chapters were written literally one-handed, like you're all in this unaligned. So apologies for typos, they are all mine. The subsequent chapters, once I realized, okay, so the chapters I've written so far are about 10 to 12 pages on my Word document. And I have structured them with like little subheadings, so just break it up a little bit. And I tend to put a quote at the beginning of a chapter and some learning objectives. And by the time I had that as a skeleton for each chapter, it actually became so easy to write because I knew where I was going. And the subheadings were generally like questions or would prompt me on to the next section. So it became, well, how can, what are the different methods of funding a pension? Oh, well, there, blah, 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 and this is why, how that works. And then the next sub question would be, okay, so how would that relate to social care? Or what do other countries do? And then so I actually didn't feel like I was writing a book. I felt like I was writing a series of paragraphs, answering a series of questions. There was a level of discipline, particularly towards the end. Okay, I need to write 3,000 words a day just to hit my deadline.
Mm.
So although the first draft of a chapter kind of spun up very naturally, the second and third drafts actually took as long, if not longer, to just tighten them up and make them really clear, really relevant to people. There was a lot of discipline in there as well. But like I say, it didn't feel like writing a book.
That's really wonderful to know because I actually find it a very easy read. Despite being a qualified actuary, I'm not necessarily someone who enjoys reading actuarial science books. I mean, well, firstly, there aren't a great deal, but I'll be honest, I don't tend to get excited about the idea of reading about solvency requirements for an insurance company. I know it's shocking. I know I probably haven't done that since I sat the exams on it, except when I read your book. I find that particularly the openings of your chapters are often really engaging. So the particular one on solvency requirements starts with some anecdotes about how you don't like holding money because it's dirty, and it's really engaging. And then you also use an example from The Simpsons about coins as well, and it genuinely opens up a really engaging way to write. I'm often struck by how nicely you've explained things in your book and how crystal clear a lot of the sentences are. Are there any sentences that you really agonized over and spent an inordinate amount of time just writing one particular sentence?
I remember there being a few of those. I
Okay.
remember it was really towards the end, and there was this one paragraph. Actually, now I can't remember which one it was, but I think I spent a whole hour writing, rewriting, changing, just meditating on this one sentence that I'd written, and going like, it's not quite what I want to say. It's not quite there. It doesn't quite lead me into the next section as much as I want it to. And I do remember then there being a few places where I was like, I just need to sit with this for a while.
Have you since been back over your book? And are there sentences and areas that you would think to yourself, oh, I really wish I could change that, but it's too late now.
There are a few places, particularly the typos, obviously, they would be what I want to change first. There's an example where that my father-in-law picked it. So he read this example and he's like, so hang on, you reversed into a wall, but you said you smashed your headlight. And he was like, don't you mean your tail light? And I was like, yes, of course. It's almost just like how I would tell a story. I would tend to use the word headlight even for the tail lights. I don't know. Maybe that's just me.
My
Yep.
advice to anyone is if they spot an error in a book that's already published, don't really mention it to the author unless they happen to say they're doing a second edition. That's the time to be like, oh, actually, I spotted this, but it's just so frustrating if
Mm.
people tell you a mistake.
More than often than not, though, I return and revisit to my own book because I want that information again. Which sounds silly because surely if I wrote it down, I know it. But that's not how brains work. But
No.
sometimes someone will ask me a question about like the solvency levels, and I think the minimum capital requirement is 40%. But let me just go check that. I'll just go look it up in my book. I actually do genuinely use my own book as a reference book, which is slightly narcissistic, maybe. But I've written it in a way that you can just go pick up the chapter you want. It's not a book that you have to read beginning to end, sit down and finish it all. I wrote it with the idea of being short chapters. And once you've read the first couple, like first three maybe, actually from that point on, you can jump into any other chapter and you'll be able to follow it on. And that's why I spent so much time on the glossary and on the index so that you can pick it up and understand the jargon. And I try not to use much jargon, but obviously there is some. And it's all explained. So I try to make it genuinely like a buffet that you can deal with it in any order. And if what you're really interested in is reserving, then, you know, jump straight to those chapters. Or if you just want to learn about supply chains, go for it. And so that's how I use it. If I need to learn about solvency now, I won't go up the attic and get all of my
Hmm?
actuarial notes and they're like this thick and I got to find the bit that I just look in my own book.
It's clearly a nicely well crafted book, and I can understand entirely why you do that. You can find the information that you want in it. And things like the glossary are really carefully written. I can't think of an area where you haven't gone to a great deal of effort to make it very, very clear and nicely written. There's quite a few anecdotes in the book, and I like that you've got like little inserts and tables and things that bring the information to life. I particularly remember recently I was telling you what I consider to be a very interesting anecdote about insurance, and you pointed out to me that I'd read it in your book. How did you go about choosing the anecdotes and the inserts to go into the book?
Some of the choices were really difficult, particularly in the fraud section. I had so many fun, exciting fraud examples that I was like, oh, I want to put all of these in. I had to be really choosy. Don't you worry though, I've been saving all the other examples in a folder on my laptop. So if there is ever a second edition, you can get all new examples. I really wanted to include those fun things because, sometimes actuarial science, some people find it a little dry. And I wanted to add those in to show that it is relevant and it is fun. In a way, it's interesting when you do something that affects society in such a big way, on such a deep level. Of course, that's going to be interesting. So I wanted to include those things, whether it's the insured value of royal tiaras or insurance fraud that demonstrate how we've got to the stage we've got to. The fact about the abattoirs is in there, that some insurers write more than all of the abattoirs in the UK because
Yeah,
abattoir
that's
is the first one on the drop down list.
mm,
I wanted to just include these things because they're what make insurance or actuarial science more generally quirky and fun. And honestly, if you were teaching a graduate or someone new to the industry, that's how you would describe things. You would use these examples. And over the years, I've explained, for example, frequency and severity to people more times than I can count. So my explanation for frequency and severity in that section was pretty much what I would say if someone asked me, examples and all.
I always feel like I've explained earned exposure like 1,000 or more times because it's always a concept that anyone new coming in needs to know, or you need to remind people of quite regularly. And it is really nice to find all these things laid out in a clear way to explain in your book. Is that a particular chapter that you perhaps found difficult to write?
I think the pricing chapter was very
Okay.
difficult.
Hopefully
Um,
not because you felt you needed help on it.
I found that really hard actually because I had too much content several
Ah,
times, several
mm,
times. There was so much I wanted to say that it became really technical. It became almost too off on a rabbit trail. And that was the one chapter that I actually ended up entirely binning. It was one of the first chapters I wrote on the iPad with my one hand. And then about 6 months in, once I'd written a few of the other chapters, showing my dad, and he just said, "Nah, start again. This is way too detailed. This is way too
mm,
mathsy. This is, you know, zoom out and tell me what you need me to know about pricing without necessarily telling me all of the mechanics."
mm.
And so that chapter actually was genuinely like delete all, start again. The other chapters that I found hard to write were at the beginning of the book. And that was because I kept running into this problem where I wanted to explain anti selection. Oh, but I couldn't because I hadn't explained expected claims
Mm,
costs.
mm.
Okay, but I to explain that, but I haven't explained really what a claim is. Okay, well, I've got to do that. And then I just kept running into these. It was like a maze where everything was a dead end. I was like, oh, I can't actually get to where I want to tell you about because there's so much foundational knowledge that you always need to learn all at the same time before we can even start on the fun stuff. So the book is kind of split into two sections, chapters. I think it's 1 to 11 maybe, and then 12 onwards. 12 onwards, it kind of assumes that you understand all those basics, and it's just more interesting use cases, whereas the first half is slightly more the concepts. But those first couple of chapters, I couldn't work out which order. Should I do pooling first, then anti-selection? Should I do claims journey first, or should I go straight to talking about risk costs? And yeah, that was really hard. I really like chapter 2 where I talk about a short history of insurance. And I really was so pleased when I hit upon that. I didn't want to make it a history book, obviously. But for me, finding a structure for all of those foundational concepts, and I was able to hang that straight off history. So Italian ship merchants, the San Francisco earthquake, and some of the issues the industry had in the 1980s and 90s. I used that as my structure. So I think the really key thing, if you are thinking of writing a book where you're stuck on a structure, is maybe how would you tell us as a story? And then you can always loop the necessary information into your story. But that was what unlocked that for me.
It is interesting because I did take in how you do give all of the concepts and then cover a pretty broad range of use cases, actually. I know there's a chapter on COVID, but you also talk about the latent risk issues like asbestos and how we deal with those as actuaries and how complicated that can be. I find it interesting that you wrote the book relatively soon after qualifying as an actuary. Did you feel any intimidation about being reasonably early in your career to write your book?
When you write a book, it's really interesting because we use the phrase, he wrote the book on that. And we use that to mean, oh, they're a total expert. And so, yeah, I did feel a lot of apprehension about being like, is it too much of a reach to say I've written the book on actuarial science? And actually,
You literally have though.
I know, right? And this is why it's daunting. But I like to think of it that I have written the book on an introduction to actuarial science. And actually, who's better placed to do that than someone who's just qualified? You writing a book for graduates when you're 10 years on from being a graduate is in some ways a lot easier than writing it when you're, maybe a couple of decades in and you've forgotten what it was like, or even that you no longer have to train graduates day to day. It was very much my reality as I was writing this book that I had recently trained graduates. So A lot of it came very naturally. I was enough of an expert for my target audience, but I definitely wouldn't say that I'm an expert in obviously all matters of actuarial science, and that's why I've written the book. There's so many different types of actuarial science, so many different avenues you can go down. So it is daunting in a way to say you've written the book on anything, but every book is unique and has a unique twist and a unique perspective. And so being able to clearly articulate why you're the expert on your specific niche is going to help you unblock that feeling of apprehension and why me? And also, if it's not going to be you, then who is it going to be?
I absolutely. I think that is good advice for young people thinking of writing a book that they should go ahead and do it. Because I think you're right about them being the well placed people to do so as well. Interesting, I think when you look at your book, it looks very serious and academic, and it is very serious and academic, but it's also extremely readable. It's got a really nice narrative to it. So in that way, it is almost a surprise when you start reading it just to find out how accessible it really is. People out there thinking about writing a book might be intimidated by actually getting it published because for most people, that's not something they would have any idea how to do. So how did you go about finding a publisher, and what was the process? Did you write some of the book first or just an outline?
I wrote a proposal that was what the book would be about. I then put a lot of effort, not in writing the book, actually, that didn't come until after I secured a publisher because I didn't want to start something and then be like, oh, no one wants this information. The thing I did spend a lot of time doing, which I think made my proposal really strong, was I spent a lot of time looking at search engine optimization type information. So, how many people each month search for what is an actuary? What do actuaries do? What is actuarial science? How do I become an actuary? I looked for all of the phrases that I could think of that hit some of those words that my book would answer. And looking at those numbers monthly, but also looking at it globally, like internationally as well, really helped me then when I came to proposing it to publishers. I just emailed a few people, publishers that
Okay.
I'd heard of.
Mm.
And it really helped me then say, hey, this book doesn't exist anywhere else. There's no other book like this book. And people clearly want to know this information. So being able to put those two things together, I think was what really encouraged the publishers that this is worth pursuing.
So your publisher is Palgrave Macmillan, and I know firsthand we were at a book related event a few months ago, and you mentioned to people that it was published by Palgrave Macmillan. I remember the reaction of how people were impressed by the very publisher you had for your book. So what was it like that moment that you got the message to say yes?
Slightly surreal.
Mm,
It's very weird, someone saying, yeah, we want to put into print something that you haven't even written yet, just based on an idea that you've had. That was kind
mm,
of weird. Having a deadline, though, really helped. Genuinely. And I think that even if you don't have a publisher yet, or even if you're not there yet, setting some deadlines for yourself is really important. I set myself the deadline that every month I wanted to complete one chapter with a skeleton of the next. A large part of that was driven by the publisher's deadline. But even so, I would highly recommend that if you're like, oh, one day I'm going to write a book, or you don't want to be like me and be like, just pitch it and then I'll work
mhm.
out the details. But,
Yeah.
if you want to get that book written, give yourself a deadline, whether that's a couple of chapters a month, or the one thing that I found really encouraging that every single day I was going to write, even if it was just a couple of sentences, I was going to write something down for my book. There's usually lots of like community groups on Facebook. There's a Reddit community. It's nice to have that online support of people also writing. But yeah, finding people who will encourage you with the writing process, but also finding editors as
Mm.
well. And they don't have to be fancy editors. They can be your loved ones are probably the best. And actually, I was really fortunate that I had my dad, my husband just kind of has a more of an actuarial lens on it. And I also pulled in some other actuarial colleagues, past and present. So thanks to all of those people. But yeah, my dad and the rest of my family, my wider family, my in laws, my auntie, all reviewed it as the perspective of my target audience. And I was so grateful for that as well. So line up some people, and they don't have to read it all. They could just read a couple of chapters or a chapter each, that really helps me zoom out and stop feeling like, oh, this is my perfect chapter. Because they read it and they said, I don't really understand how you get from here to here. Can you explain that
Wow.
again? And
Mhm.
the conversations that I had with people after they've read it helped me to see what I hadn't done well, even though from my perspective it was all perfect. So it really helped me. So definitely find yourself some support, whether that's anonymous people online who are also writing a book, or whether it's family and friends. Just it has to be people who are willing to be really honest with you. And my dad is always that person for me who will read something and go, I don't like this at all. This is not this is not the chapter for this book. Start again. And so you have to have those honest people.
It is good to have honest people around you that tell you the truth, definitely. Well, it is, I say, a wonderful book, and you quite rightly should be very proud of your achievement in putting it out into the world. It's an excellent resource for non-actuaries, actuaries, people thinking of going into actuarial science in the wider world to find out all about it. So well done, Catrin. Thank you very much for being with me today. It's been excellent talking to you about the process of writing your book.
Amazing. Thank you for having me. And next time on the PriceWriters podcast, we'll be talking about the book Lead Your Team in Your First 100 Days by Neve O'Keefe. We're really excited to learn about this. And particularly if you're starting a new role, come and join us next time.
PriceWriters transforms pricing professionals into the most respected leaders in insurance. Find out more about our capability fits by visiting pricewriters.com.